Okay, now I can introduce our speaker, Tarek Khalil, who is an attorney, lecturer, and activist. He has worked with the Illinois Coalition Against Torture, an organization which seeks to end domestic police torture and raise awareness of global torture. He also clerked with CAIR Chicago, the nation's largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy group. Tarek is currently a board member and education coordinator for the American Muslims for Palestine in Chicago. He lectures on topics such as modern Palestinian history, Middle East politics, and Palestinian rights under international law. Please give Tarek a silent, warm welcome. Tarek?
Yes, how are you? Thank you to Middle East Peace Now for having me for this very important topic. I appreciate the work that you do, and it's such an honor to be here on a beautiful Saturday morning. It's nice and beautiful here in the Chicagoland area, so that makes this even better. So, all right, I want to just get straight to the point because of my limited time here, and I wanted to focus on a very particular topic, a topic that I believe sometimes goes unnoticed in the discussion for Palestinian rights, in the discourse for Palestinian rights and justice, and the liberation project that we should all be devoted to. And that is the Palestinian citizens of Israel. These are the Palestinians that remained within the regularized borders of the state of Israel that have been internationally recognized. And as a result of the Nakba in 1948, 750,000 or so Palestinians were dispossessed from their homes, and approximately 160,000 Palestinians remained in what has become the state of Israel. So Israel touts itself as being a democracy. And when it says that, the way that it tries to couch the language in order to have some kind of colorable claim is to say that, well, within the borders that are internationally recognized, Israel is a democracy. And there could only be a critique or assessments of Israel's policy vis-a-vis how it treats its Palestinian citizens. But as Israel calls them, Arab Israelis, and I'll get into that in a moment, why they're not referenced as such. I just want to lay out very, very briefly the basic Zionist objectives of the Zionist movement and then eventually the state of Israel. These objectives have a lot of subparts, but generally speaking, it is the conquest of land, the dispossession of the indigenous Palestinians, and the ingathering of Jewish exiles. Put simply, capture the territory, get rid of its native population, and bring in as many Jews as possible into that population to take over the land from which these Palestinians were dispossessed. So these are the objectives. So every particular measure, whether it's taken by left-wing Zionists, right-wing Zionists, liberal, conservative, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, secular, it really, really doesn't matter what strand you're talking about. All of the strands focus on some elements within these three objectives. So this explains Israel's founding. It also explains the Zionist movement leading up to Israel's founding, and of course explains the present as well. Now, this map is well known to many people. This map illustrates the land conquest element of the Zionist objectives. So from 1946 up to the present, you see this transformation where more Palestinian land has been taken from the Palestinians, notably from 67 until now, where Israel has been in full control of the entire area of historic Palestine. When we say historic Palestine, a synonym for that could be mandatory Palestine or just Palestine, which refers to the area from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea and encompasses today what is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and what is modern day Israel. And the point of my talk today is to not get into the occupation that began in 67 of the West Bank and Gaza. I want to talk about the basic institutional structure of Israel and how the principles that govern its entire focus in the entire area of Palestine, especially the state of Israel itself. So let's take a look at some documents, some of Israel's founding documents and its laws, and see how Israel perpetuates the Zionist project and still attempts to tout itself as a democracy. So if you look at Israel's Declaration of Independence, it specifies a Jewish state. It specifies the ingathering of Jewish exiles. But there's a contradictory promise, because in that same declaration, it guarantees, quote, complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. So you can see how you can't have the latter and also have the former. You can't be an exclusivist state that tends to and is made for one people and then say that the other people that live there also have complete and equal rights. There's an internal contradiction there. And this is also true of one of the earliest documents that we must take note of, and that's the Balfour Declaration. That's not the topic of this discussion, but in that declaration itself, the same thing. There were contradictory elements involved. You want to promise a nation for the Jewish people, yet there's already a nation that lives in Palestine, 1/9 of which were Palestinians. So these contradictory promises within declarations and laws are rife within Israel, mainly the Declaration of Independence. But soon after Israel's founding, so 1948, 750,000 Palestinians were dispossessed from their homes. Now Israel became a state and eventually became recognized by the United Nations a year later, and it went straight to work. And some of its foundational laws, or one of its foundational laws, emphasizes the Jewish and democratic nature of the state itself. Notice the inherent contradiction there. Democracy, which necessarily implies full political and national equality, and you are only the nation state of one nation and at the expense of another nation. So that inherent contradiction lives in Israel today, and it's actually much more entrenched today than it's ever been. But these four basic laws, and I just want to spend 20 seconds on the concept of a basic law. Israel does not have a constitution the way the United States has a constitution. Israel has a set of basic laws that govern in a sense as a constitution itself. So every basic law that's enacted is an additional element to Israel's overall constitutional structure. So these four basic laws emphasize the Jewish and democratic state. Notice something significant here. There's about 20-something year gap between the latter two laws. Remember 3 years ago, it seems like a lifetime ago, Israel enacted its most recent basic law, which is Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people. This law, as opposed to the three prior, constitutionalizes apartheid, puts apartheid in the open and makes it overt that self-determination is unique to the Jewish people, that development of land and settlement is necessary to the survival of the state of Israel. Arabic, which was an official language under Israeli law prior to this law, has now taken a second-tier status. So these elements have now grown, and the institutional structure, the institutional racist structure of Israel has become much more pronounced as a result of this law. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but one of these laws, the Human Dignity and Liberty Law, I just want to spend just a brief minute on this. If you look up this basic law, it emphasizes, as I said prior, the Jewish and democratic nature of the state of Israel. But there's also an exception in the law itself. The exception is any law, we preserve human dignity and liberty, except laws that are befitting the values of the state of Israel. What are those values? Look at the title of this, Jewish and democratic. These are the values of the state of Israel. So if it is a law to preserve that, so in essence, if it's a law to preserve an apartheid element within the state, it's a law that does not contravene this particular basic law. And notice a word that is intentionally omitted in this basic law, equality. So you have human dignity you have liberty, but intentionally omitted is the word equality. So in Israel's constitution, equality is not a necessary element within Israel's basic law structure, as it is in the United States. So if you hear Republicans or politicians talk about, Israel shares our values, mention this to them. Do you share this value? Is equality not enshrined in US constitutional law? In Israeli law, it is not enshrined. So there's an inherent contradiction right there. One thing that is obviously not mentioned in our media discourse is that the Palestinians that lived or that live in Israel today were living under military rule, similar to the military occupation that you see now in the West Bank and Gaza. So from 48 to 1966, Palestinian citizens lived under this military regime. They were constituted as a security risk, still are, by the way, and are suspect by the state and still are, by the way. So if you look at how this military rule operated, it imposed closures, curfews, indefinite house arrests. It required exit and entry permits. Sound familiar? That's what's happening in the West Bank, right? Seized property. Sound familiar? And deported Palestinians with no recourse to appeal. Now, while this structure did end in 1966, and I'll get into that in a moment, I'm going to make the case that it did not end in 1966. The Kfar Qasim massacre, which is what I have highlighted here, this kind of set the stage for a Palestinian refocusing of the Palestinian citizens refocusing of its agenda. So the Israeli military border police killed 49 Palestinians in this village. Most of the victims were farmers returning from work. They did not know that there was a curfew in place. Remember, these curfews, you don't need a 30-day notice for them. It could be a 3-minute notice. Oh, we just imposed a curfew. You have to be in the house by a certain time. These farmers coming home from work, not knowing that there was a curfew imposed, were killed. That is military life. That is military rule life in Israel from 48 to 66. Now back to that year. Technically, the structure itself ended in 1966, but the remnants of it and various mechanisms, especially surveillance, did not go away until 1968. So I can make the following claim. In some part of historic Palestine, military rule has existed since Israel's founding. So, and that still persists today. So since Israel's founding, some portion of Palestine has been under military rule. Some will say, to be more accurate, you have to have that 6-month window because military rule ended in 1966 in December, and then the military occupation of June 1967, so you have that 6-month window. But because the vestiges of that military rule did not end in 1968, legally speaking, military rule did exist throughout some part of historic Palestine since Israel's inception. Now, remember that inherent contradiction that I was talking about, Jewish supremacy versus democracy. That is the inherent contradiction. So Israel's self-definition is an ethnic state. So what that means is it is a state for the Jewish people, not the state for all of its citizens. Palestinian rights are subordinated to the rights of Jews, to the value of Jewish sovereignty and supremacy. So the Jewishness of the state supersedes the Israeliness of its citizens. Israeliness is a civic identity, whereas Jewishness is a national identity, and the Palestinian citizens of Israel are not regarded as nationals of the state. They are only citizens of the state. So by that structure, Israel accommodates the Arab Israelis, and I put that in quote, and I'll get to that in a minute, but keeps them institutionally segregated. There are various laws that are in place that kind of, put this institutional structure in a more legalistic fashion. So Israel has to pass laws to sort of legitimize or try to legitimize its institutionally racist structure. So a couple of these foundational laws are the law of return, which essentially means every Jew, no matter where you are in the world, even if you have no family in what is Israel today, even if you have no historical ties to Israel today, every Jew has the right to come to this country and become what's called an ole, which is a Jewish immigrant. So you can become a citizen of the state of Israel and become a national of the state of Israel. If you're a Jew in Russia or a Jew in Poland or a Jew in South America, wherever you're at, and you can come and become and take up citizenship in Israel. But if you're a Palestinian refugee who have historic, religious, cultural ties to Palestine, you do not have the right to come back. And another law, the Citizenship Law, which was enacted in 1952 and its amendment in 2008. The amendment itself allows for the revocation of citizenship on grounds of breach of trust or disloyalty to the state. Now, on its face, it applies neutrally, but because there's no meaning fleshed out to this terminology, breach of trust or disloyalty, what does that mean? Undermining the values of the state of Israel. What are those values? Jewish and democratic. So this law was aimed specifically against the Palestinian refugees. If you are a refugee and you left, but you technically were dispossessed, you were ethnically cleansed, you lose your rights to come back, you lose your property rights, and you lose the right to become a citizen of the country. Jews can come back using the law of return. They don't need to use the citizenship law. Now, if you look at the Knesset's website, you will see this law titled the Nationality Law, but that's a mistranslation of the Hebrew itself. It is the Citizenship Law, because remember, Palestinians, or as they're referred to within Zionist discourse, Arab Israelis, are not nationals of the state. They're only citizens or civics of the state. And the 2003 Citizenship and Entry Law, this was meant to be a so-called temporary measure, but it has been renewed ever since and is still in existence right now. It deprives Palestinians of two fundamental rights, the right to equality and the right to establish a family with whomever they choose. So if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel and you want to marry somebody that lives in Ramallah or Jenin or someplace in the West Bank, that person cannot come to the state of Israel and take up citizenship. That law has become less restrictive due to legal charges by Adala and other organizations, but it's still in place and it is still meant to target specifically the Palestinians. Notice something here. This law, this 2003 Citizenship Law, does not apply to Jewish settlers. So if you're a Jew in Israel, you can marry a Jewish settler, and that settler can come and live in the state of Israel. So this is discrimination based on nationality. And one more thing before I move away from this slide. Going back to the law of return, do not confuse this with an immigration law. This law is a nationality law. Immigration law, the way it within Zionist discourse implies foreigners coming back and trying to take up citizenship, becoming naturalized. The law of return is a nationality law. You can be a foreigner. So long as you're a Jew, you can come and take up citizenship. So this distinction is very, very crucial to Israel's institutional structure. The difference between nationality and citizenship. Now, in the United States, you do not have that kind of distinction. So if you're a Polish American, Arab American, Chinese American, Nigerian American, you're American. Once you become a citizen, you have the same exact rights, at least on paper. You have the same exact rights as any other American citizen. Not so in Israel. Jewish nationality is the only nationality recognized in Israeli law. So if you're a Palestinian, and now I'm going back to that term that I didn't really flesh out before, Arab Israeli. Within Zionist discourse, Palestinians are referred to as Arab Israeli, not as Palestinians. Why? Because Palestinian is a national label, and Palestinians are denied their nationality within the state, but they can keep their ethnic label, Arab, and they can keep their citizen label or civic label, Israeli, but they cannot be nationals of the state because they're not Jews. So they can acquire citizenship on the basis of birth, immigration, residency, or marriage, but that has been diluted based on the 2003 law that I just discussed. So Israeli citizenship is legally, politically, and ideologically distinct from nationality, the complete opposite of how it is here in the United States. So what does that really mean in practice? Well, it means that Israeli law does not confer the right to benefit from the right of Palestinians to benefit from Israel's national institutions, the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency and its subsidiaries, the Jewish National Fund. These national or parastatal organizations that work hand in hand, essentially extensions of the state itself, provide services with respect to land, utilities, developmental planning, housing, et cetera, education, healthcare, you name it. These institutions operate in such a way that it confers these rights to Jews, but not to Palestinians, or within Zionist discourse referred to as Arab Israelis. And I want you to look at two Supreme Court, High Court of Justice opinions that address this notion of Israeliness or nationality. The Israeli Supreme Court struggled to reconcile these two concepts, because if Israel recognized an Israeli nationality, that means that the Palestinian citizens would have equal national status within the state. So it can't do that. It must operate in such a way and to render opinions in such a way as to maintain that Zionist paradigm. And that Zionist paradigm necessitates the supremacy of the Jews over the Palestinians. That is a necessary element. So the court concluded that there's no evidence of an Israeli nationality that is separate and distinct from Jewish nationality. And notice that contradiction. So Palestinians are Israeli citizens, but if we recognize Israeli nationality, then they take up the mantle of nationality, and then they become equal. We become a democracy, and we can't have that. We have to maintain our apartheid rule. Of course, they didn't say it like that, but that's the interpretation here, is that to maintain this apartheid apparatus, we cannot confer an Israeli nationality. So please look at these two opinions and read them for yourselves and see how the court is struggling as it's writing the opinions. So one of the elements, as I mentioned, of the Zionist conquest of Palestine is the ingathering of the exiles. So David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, said the main thing is the absorption of immigrants. So the state's fate is dependent on aliyah, or immigration. So we have to have as many Jews as possible in this land that we now conquered and dispossessed the Palestinians from. So this is a necessary element to maintain that Zionist project. Approximately 3 million Jews came to Israel since its establishment in 1948, the height of which was in the 90s during the fall of the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the former Soviet Union. These immigrants were necessary to maintain that demographic balance, that demographic ratio. And that is why Palestinians, while still are 2-to-1 in terms of their progeny compared to Jews, they're still only 20% of the population within the state of Israel, mainly because of this immigration, this mass influx of Jews. And notice something interesting here, that the greatest fertility rate in Palestine is the Muslim population in East Jerusalem and the Bedouin in the Naqab, or the Negev. The Palestinian Bedouins many of which live in unrecognized villages. So these villages don't have the necessary means for basically survival, and they're treated as such within Israeli law. So they're not accounted for when it comes to these services. And in East Jerusalem, you have a different type of entrenched occupation where the wall, or the apartheid wall, divides families and communities and villages and areas, using that wall as a means to dispossess or forcibly expel Palestinians east of the wall into other areas of the West Bank. Okay, there's an interesting concept within Israeli discourse, within Zionist discourse, and that is the concept of demographic threat. The greatest demographic threat to the state of Israel are these Palestinians, the subject of this talk. And this became more known, more fleshed out as a result of the Koenig report in 1976. This is an unofficial document, but this report disclosed the demographic threat, which essentially means the increased population of Palestinians. This report focused on various elements. I don't want to get into the weeds of all of them, but essentially the goal is to contain and marginalize the Palestinian Arab community in Israel and fulfilling the project of Judaizing the Galilee and diluting its Palestinian Arab population. So the increase in numbers of Palestinians is a threat to the survival of the state of Israel. Just imagine if in the United States, Congress was given a report that advocated for the containment and marginalization of the Black community, or the Asian community, or the Middle East community, or the Arab community. Imagine if that was presented, the outcry, the condemnation that you would see from both parties on this very topic. But with Israel, both parties seem to be okay with it. And it's not regarded as racist. It's not regarded as apartheid-like. It's not regarded as unacceptable or immoral or unconstitutional or any of these terms that they love to invoke when it comes to these measures when it's presented here in Congress. So remember that hypocrisy, and understand that it comes from a place of it comes from a place of misunderstanding, but also comes from a place of not knowing how the population understands these topics and how they interplay within the government or within the societies in which they live. A specific event that I want to talk about, and when you talk about the Palestinian citizens of Israel, you can't not talk about this. This was a very momentous event. And as this Koenig report became public, land confiscations intensified. And the Galilee, which was the subject of the Koenig report, erupted in protest. And this led to the shooting of 6 Palestinians by the Israeli police on this day, March 30th, 1976. Palestinians called for a strike, a general strike. And these demonstrations against land confiscations was in response to the plan to Judaize the Galilee. But this was really a turning point in 1976. The Palestinian community, Palestinian Arab community in Israel understood that it is essential that they focus from within as well. And you'll see that later developing and becoming much more pronounced. And I'll get to that at the latter part of my talk. The second element of Israel's objectives is land conquest. So the ingathering of the exiles is one element. Conquest is another. You may say, well, in 48, wasn't that accomplished? Not quite, because remember, Palestinians owned approximately 93, and this is very interesting, is that the Zionist movement only owned about 7%, approximately, maybe actually 0.3% less than that, about 6.7% of the land in Palestine before Israel's creation in 1948. As a result of the dispossession of the Palestinians, Israel had to go to work and had to legalize its conquest in some way. So as a result of these maneuvers, Israel, or approximately 93% of the land in Israel, is under the direct control of the state and its national institutions, such as the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency and the Jewish National Fund. These lands are referred to as Israel's lands. So not for the Palestinian people. Palestinian Arabs own about 3.5% of the territory, even though they make up 20% of the population. So Israel enacted laws to allow for the transfer of these lands. The Land Acquisition Law of 1953, the Absentee Property Law of 1950. So these laws together work in conjunction with one another, right? Israel expropriated the land for so-called essential settlement and development needs, essentially meaning to expand Jewish settlement. And the absentee property law was the main mechanism for legalizing land conquest. So all of the property that these refugees had, all of the property has now been transferred to the state. And the state can now do what it wants with these properties. The Land Ordinance acquisition was a law in 1943, but I thought Israel was created in 1948. How could this law be in effect? Israel took this law from the British mandatory authorities. So under the British mandate from 1922 to 1948, the British colonial presence enacted laws to fulfill the Balfour Declaration, or the mandate for Palestine. One of these laws was the Land Ordinance Acquisition for Public Purposes Law. This was used to sanction the confiscation of large tracts of Palestinian-owned land for quote unquote public purposes. And you see a similar type of structure in Silwan and in Sheikh Jarrah and other areas in East Jerusalem, where Israel employs that same logic. Much of this land was used to establish new Jewish towns and villages. So Israel took this law and essentially incorporated it within Israeli law. So I talked about the Zionist paradigm. The basic methods of maintaining the Zionist paradigm is by constitutionalizing apartheid. This came with the nation state law. And essentially what this means is racial domination in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression. I basically took from the two main instruments that define apartheid, which is the Apartheid Convention, specifically the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid in 1973, and the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. These two definitions together flesh out the meaning of apartheid. This constitutionalization process was led by the Knesset. And one particular Zionist talking point, liberal Zionist talking point, is that, oh, the courts are there to redress Palestinian grievances. Israel is a democracy and it uses its courts. Palestinians can just go to the court. Why do you need internet? Why do you need the United Nations? Why do you need the ICC or the ICJ to render opinions? The Israeli High Court allows Palestinians to come and present their case, and often their grievances are redressed. That couldn't be further from the truth. However, the High Court of Justice rules in a liberal fashion, but its rulings still remain within the Zionist paradigm. Remember that basic law that I mentioned earlier, the law of dignity and liberty, of human dignity and liberty, that intentionally omits equality? The court interpreted it couldn't maintain its liberal credentials and say that equality is not enshrined in Israeli law. But the court said that this equality is only equality in the sense that it is compatible with human dignity. So it is not complete, it's not full equality, it's equality only within the context of human dignity and to the extent that human dignity allows for such equality. So notice the struggle that the court goes through in providing these interpretations and trying to maintain its interpretation within a liberal framework, but still maintain the ultra-contradictory Zionist framework. So it's a very difficult job that the Israeli High Court has, and because there's that inherent contradiction, it does a lousy job at trying to explain those. One of the other basic laws that Israel employs to maintain its Zionist paradigm is the basic law of the Knesset, which was enacted in 1958. Article 7A of that law conditions political participation on acceptance of the state's identity as Jewish and democratic. So what does this mean in practice? In practice, this means that if you're a political party and you want to participate in Israeli elections, you must accept the apartheid structure that we have in place. That is the interpretation. If you do not accept the Jewishness of the state, you Palestinians must accept the Jewishness of the state and its democratic nature as well. But the Jewishness of the state, you cannot participate in political activity. So if you're a political party that calls for a nation state for all of its citizens, like kind of what we have here in the US, that's anathema. That is against Israeli law to advocate for that. So this is the context in that defines the Palestinian political participation in Israel. I want to focus on one particular element here because it really goes to the structure that I've been referring to all along. What is known as admissions committees. They're used as a mechanism to exclude Palestinian citizens from ownership and use of land. So these are bodies that select housing applicants for housing units and plots of land in particular communities in Israel. They operate in 85% of the villages within the 48 area. Each committee includes an official from the Jewish Agency or the World Zionist Organization. But notice the standard that is in place here. It may seem neutral on its face, but it's really racist at its core. And that's the suitability standard. So they have to determine whether the candidate is suited to social life in a small community or agricultural settlement. That seems rather neutral, right? But what does that mean? Suited to social life in a, okay, maybe well, they're not part of the same nation. That's not suited to the social life. They can take that, it's a very expansive meaning, and you can make, by logic, an expansive interpretation of it. And you can read into it your racist ideas, and you can justify it using those racist ideas and still appear as though it's neutral, even though it's racist at its core. There are actually various bylaws within these communities that include loyalty to the Zionist vision as a condition for admission. So if you're an anti-Zionist, pretty much, you will likely not be a beneficiary of these admission committees. So, I mean, I didn't get into all of the basic elements that govern the structure, but I wanted to focus on some of the important ones. And now we're entering a different period. As a result of this history of military rule, of institutional discrimination, of apartheid, of legalizing land conquest and transferring land illegally, but using laws as a way to justify and legitimize that illegal process. There were documents that were published in 2006 and 2007 by political, civic, and intellectual leaders that share the notion that Palestinians, while a minority, are indigenous to Palestine. So now, as a result of this history, and now I'm going to focus on other parts of that history that I did not mention that gave way to these documents. These are 4 documents. I'm not going to get into all of them and their details. You can look them up. I have the titles for you right here. But all the documents share the demands of historical redress, changing the political structure from within, having kind of a consociational democracy, an all-inclusive democracy that is not Zionistic in its orientation, and demanding equality before the law. Basically, the abolition of the Zionist paradigm. That's what these vision documents envision and call for.
We've got about 10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll be done before that. So these future vision documents, what led to them? One of the main things that led to them was the Oslo Accords. Now remember, the Oslo Accords, the focus of the Oslo Accords were the remaining 22% of historic Palestine, which is the West Bank and Gaza, not 1948 territory, not Israel. So the Palestinians, the 1.8 million Palestinians that live in Israel, were dismissed, omitted from the Oslo Accords. So by that fact alone, the Palestinian leadership within Israel realized that we have to focus on ourselves as well. Since our leaders, so-called leadership, is not focusing on us, we must now focus on ourselves and demand what is rightfully ours. Another measure that led to the future vision documents were the October 2000 attacks. As a result of the Second Intifada and the protests that came from that, from Palestinians that live in Israel, Israel appointed a state commission of inquiry to investigate attacks by the Israeli police against Palestinian citizens who protested the Second Intifada. This was known as the Or Commission. This commission criticized the discrimination endured by the Palestinians and called for the state to rectify it. It alluded to the fact that because of Israel's self-definition as Jewish and democratic, Palestinians felt estranged. And as a result of this commission, as a result of the Second Intifada, really, and as a result of the Oslo Accords, future vision documents were in place. And it is, I don't know how to stop share here, but okay. These future vision documents essentially called for emphasizing the indigeneity of the Palestinian community and calling for the collective rights of the Palestinian people. And the discourse since then in our media, in our political discourse has changed drastically over the last 15 or so years. And now you're seeing this apartheid label gaining traction, not just with respect to Israel's policy in the West Bank, but also Israel's policy, or the West Bank and Gaza, but also Israel's policy within its own territory itself. And now you can easily make the case that Israel is an apartheid state, not just an apartheid regime operating in the occupied territories, but it is an apartheid state within all of historic Palestine through its use of law, through its use of mechanisms that deny Palestinians, freedom in various elements, that are dear to us in our daily life. And it is important to understand this Zionist paradigm as such, because if your starting point is 1967 in the analysis of the Palestinian quest for justice and liberation, you've picked the wrong starting point. And you have omitted the crucial history, the root cause of the history. And that root cause is the Nakba, the catastrophe that began in 1948. And the Palestinians that live in Israel live in that Nakba framework as well. And you can't dismiss them. And you can't treat them as Ilan Pappé, Israeli historian, called them, the forgotten Palestinians, because they should always be remembered and always be part of that discourse. And that is why the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is so crucial to our evolution in terms of our discourse with respect to Palestinian rights, because the focus is all inclusive. It's not just limited in scope to the West Bank or Gaza. It encompasses the entire Palestinian community. That includes the refugee community that live outside of historic Palestine. It encompasses the Palestinians that live in Israel. So full equality for them is one of the basic demands of the BDS movement. And that is why it's important for us to keep that discourse within the framework of the collective rights of the Palestinians, and not just, selectively attributing those rights to just refugees or Palestinians that live in East Jerusalem, or in a fragmented fashion. Part of that Zionist paradigm is to maintain that fragmentation. And it is our job to make sure that we intervene in that and always refer to the Palestinian collective and their rights as a collective, and focus on all 12 or 13 million of us, and not just a few million of us that live within historic Palestine. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Tarek. We are collecting questions from you, audience, so please use the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we will collect your questions and ask them in the order in which they were received. So we will have about 20 to 25 minutes or so for this open Q&A time.
Hey Tarek, this is Maya speaking. I will be asking you questions. Thank you again so much for this very eloquent and informing talk. Don't have words right now. Thank you. So the first question is, have you or anyone else made an effort to have dialogue with congressmen and women to discuss this on a legal standpoint? I would think all those lawyers would pay attention to the inequities when phrased in a legal way.
Yeah, myself, I didn't make that a focus as much as just the basic congressional measures that exist right now. For instance, HR 25990, which addresses abuse and torture of Palestinian children and annexation and other illegal measures taken by Israel. You have to be strategic when you talk to congressional members. When they ask me questions, I do flesh out the settler colonial structure, the apartheid structure that exists, and how that governs all various areas of the Palestinian polity especially the Palestinian citizens of Israel. So, but it's more academic at that point because there's no initiatives in place that really address that. And we have to be strategic and tackle things on a case-by-case basis and as part of a progression. You know, if someone asks me what can Congress do, and it's $3.8 billion annual aid to Israel. Well, who's going to present that in Congress and get that approved tomorrow? So we have to be strategic and target things as they come.
Thank you. The next question is, please clarify what body wrote the Future Vision documents?
Oh, made up of activists, leaders, politicians, professionals. I mean, it's various. It's a whole list of people that put together these Future Vision documents. And essentially, the point of these documents is to refocus the agenda for these Palestinian citizens, to refocus it on them. Well, if we're being dismissed in the international community, well, hold on a minute. We're a second-class citizen group that live within the state that's being portrayed as a democracy. It is not a democracy. And by emphasizing various elements that in place that prove it, and also providing solutions in terms of how to bring about an inclusive society that is based on democratic principles and not based on ethnocratic principles.
Thank you. Our next question is, how would you view the extension of Israeli citizenship to the Palestinians in the occupied territories? Could such a development eventually force Israel to change its paradigm to the institutionalization of equality?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, during the talk about annexation a year ago, when there was this big hype in Israel, or this big discussion between whether Israel should annex Area C, which encompasses about 60% of the West Bank, and by doing that, taking in about 170, 180,000 Palestinians and making them citizens, because Israel can maintain the mantra that it is a democracy based on the rule of law if it does not afford citizenship to the population that it has just absorbed. So I always present the question, well, why doesn't, who was prime minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, why doesn't he just annex the whole territory? Just take the whole thing, man. Why do you have to limit it to Area C and just the settlements? Just take the whole territory. Well, if you do that, then you encompass the 2.5 to 3 million Palestinians that live in areas A and B, which is about 40% of the West Bank. So remember those three basic objectives of Zionism: conquest of land, ingathering of the exiles, and the dispossession of the indigenous. If you conquer more land, but don't dispossess that large population, it's a balancing act. So we want as much territory as possible with as few Palestinians as possible. We can't achieve that by affording citizenship to everybody that lives in the West Bank. It's easy to omit the Gaza Strip because there are no Jews there and it's less biblically significant. So if anything, Israel is wishing that Gaza doesn't even exist right now, because that's almost 2 million people. And remember that demographic threat element. Gaza, if the population in Gaza and the West Bank take up citizenship in Israel, you have demographic parity. About 6 to 7 million Palestinians and 6 to 7 million Jews within historic Palestine. That's not even accounting for the diaspora community, many of whom are refugees. So remember that when this question is always posed or this issue is always presented, that you have to understand those three elements in conjunction with one another. You can't have one contradict the other, and you can't have one, all three have to balance out in some way. So you need Jews coming into the state, you need more Palestinians to leave the state, you need more territory with the least amount of Palestinians as possible. It cannot achieve that if it incorporates the entire West Bank and the people inside it. If it does do that, the Zionist project will come to an end.
Thank you for defining these in really approachable ways. So we have another question. This one's from Ruben. They say, thank you for this excellent and detailed perspective. What do you think have been or would be the most effective legal approaches to confronting Israel with their behavior, policies, and contradictory legal structures that could actually have an impact?
Okay, I like using the language of international law. That's what the BDS movement uses as well, and I like that that sort of presentation because it resonates with congressional members. It resonates with politicians. You're not using, ideological structures. I'm not going to the PLO charter and quoting stuff from there and saying, well, based on this, we have a right to this, and or using biblical phrases or scripture in some way to justify the rights of the Palestinian people. Just use the language of international law. International law is not perfect, but it gives us a framework from which we can fulfill the rights, at least on a minimalist level, and dismantle the Zionist apparatus at a maximalist level. So international law calls for the right of Palestinians to be repatriated to their homeland. So the right of return, the right to compensation, to restitution, to satisfaction, freedom of movement, ending the apartheid wall, dismantling the apartheid wall, full equality. So just mention these international norms and laws that exist. You can use human rights instruments, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. You can use the International Convention on the International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid. You can use the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. You can use the Fourth Geneva Convention when you're talking about humanitarian law. Article 49.6, you can actually present that to your elected officials and say, well, hold on a minute. This law, which is part of customary international law, says that you cannot transfer members of your territory into the territory that you occupy. These settlements are illegal. They're actually a war crime under international law. I'm not making it up. I'm not picking this out of, from the air. These are well-established legal principles. And if you point to that, I believe that can resonate with the American public and furthermore, resonate with our elected officials and those that are running for office. So employing international law, I believe, is an effective tool. You can also present the moral argument. You can say, well, okay, look, when you have a situation between oppressor, oppressed, colonizer, colonized, occupier, occupied, dispossessor, dispossessed, who really has the right of self-defense here? Who's really the victim here? Who's the perpetrator? I mean, we can't present this as some kind of symmetrical conflict between two warring parties. That's not the case at all. It is a settler colonial apartheid regime that is operating with a political mission of establishing and maintaining a state for one people at the expense of another. That's the framing that you have to come with. And when you present it in that way, they can only counter it through an intellectual answer. They can't use talking points in countering that. They can try, but if you present it in that way, they can disagree on those premises and say, well, it's not settler colonial, but they have to explain to you why it's not. So long as you're armed with those tools and you understand how to present that argument, I think that can resonate with almost anybody.
Thank you. Our next question is, Lucia asks, I know that young Israeli Jews must serve in the military. In the past, the Arab citizens, so Palestinian Israelis or Palestinians, were not allowed into the military, and then they were dismissed out on the veteran benefits and job opportunities available to those who had served in the military. Is this still the case? Yes,
it is. Interestingly, that has varied throughout the years. It's kind of taken kind of a roller coaster approach, and this is something that I didn't talk about in my talk. And thank you for the question, because it's something that needs to be mentioned. I just wanted to fit as much information as possible. And one of the other aspects that I didn't talk about for the sake of time is NPAs, national priority areas, and how those function within Israel, how to determine which area falls within a national priority area, and as such can receive certain benefits and funding and so on. And that encompasses mainly Jewish areas. Military service is actually used as a means of discrimination against the Palestinian Arabs. Because they're exempt from service, Israel uses that opportunity to further its apartheid structure. So the way that it does that is that it affords benefits to not just those that serve, but their families and those that live in the household, etc. So many people benefit from it that have not even been in military service. And also, military service is used as a means of denying Palestinians particular benefits in the realm of education or in the realm of land use and other particular benefits that the state offers. And interestingly so, that Israel tries so hard to present itself as accommodating the Palestinian citizenry by, we're not telling them to fight in our wars. They're free to live and receive the benefits, and they don't have to fight in our wars. That's not true. They don't receive those benefits. That's the key. It's used as a way to deny them those benefits. And yes, that unfortunately still does exist. Now there is an exception within the Palestinian community, and that's the Druze community, and that's because of an agreement, I believe, in the 1950s. I think it was 1959. They had an agreement, the Druze leadership and the state, and based on that agreement, they actually do serve in the IDF. But that's a little inside baseball.
Our next question is from Virgil. What has happened to Palestinian citizens who protested during the recent bombing of Gaza?
Yeah, so I liked what I saw, especially in town of Lid. In Lid, that you have this reconnection between Palestinians that live in Israel and Palestinians that live in the occupied territories. And it's that connection that ignites these types of responses. And I believe the Future Vision documents contributed immensely to that, kind of refocusing and reshaping how we talk about Palestinians generally as a general polity. I liked what I saw. I've seen it before. I know it exists. We just have to make sure that we press the point that these Palestinians are part of the struggle for justice and liberation, and not just relegated to a status where they have to function within the state apparatus and achieve their rights from within the state in which they live, rather than the collective rights guaranteed to them under international law. So we just have to make sure that we keep the focus on the entire Palestinian polity.
We have Betty Was, or Betty is asking, we keep hearing about Israel's success with vaccines against COVID. Are vaccinations provided to Palestinian population as well?
In a limited fashion. What you mean, okay, so the Palestinians in occupied territories are different than, it functions differently than the Palestinians that live within Israel. The Palestinians that live in the occupied territories, for a long while, especially during the height of COVID, oh yeah, absolutely. That's been a little more relaxed now, but that did exist to a point.
Sorry, I'm like flipping through screens. So Judy asks, please review again the difference between the term Arab Israeli and nationalist. What can't they be treated? What can't they be treated the same? The word national implies a country, but what legal power does this have?
Well, it's existed since Israel's founding in 1948, and Israel has been able to make Israel has tried to fuse those distinctions, but those distinctions are definitely pronounced, as evidenced by the Supreme Court in trying to reconcile the concept. The Supreme Court had trouble reconciling the concept of Israeli nationality with the Jewish identity of the state. You can't, and you can tell in the way that they wrote the opinion. They tried to say that, that there is this seamless social life within Israel, but they tried to color those divisions. They tried to blur the line of division, but that division is definitely there conceptually and also in practice. So the concept of nationalities is understood differently in Israel. The way that Israel understands nationality is the nation of a particular people that, quote unquote, descend from this particular territory, and everybody else is a foreigner. So only those people can be considered nationals of the state. Here in the United States, your nationality, your Polish heritage, your German heritage, your Brazilian heritage, wherever you're from, has no relationship whatsoever to your relationship to the state. So your relationship with the state depends on your citizenship. So if you become an American, you have the right to vote just like everybody else. Now, within Zionist discourse, the right to vote is always touted as, a reason why Israel is a democracy. But for those that don't really understand what democracy stands for, if you trivialize democracy to just merely voting rights, you don't understand democracy at all. Voting rights is one element of it, but also benefiting from the services that the state offers, benefiting from the structure itself and how you can participate within that structure. In the United States, once you become an American, you are exactly equal to somebody who's been living here and their families their whole lives. But in Israel, the indigenous Palestinians are considered foreigners, and foreigners are considered indigenous. So reversing the reality on its head. And that is why those concepts have to remain separate in order for Israel to maintain the argument, to preserve its status as a Jewish and so-called democratic state. But the inherent contradiction is definitely there. And if you look at those Supreme Court opinions, you will see, if you read them multiple times, they're struggling themselves in writing the language in terms of how to reconcile these concepts, because they know at heart it's racist at its core.
Amen. So this is last call for questions, but someone was asking, will you explain the BDS movement? And so I will say we did put the BDS movement website in the chat. So maybe if you just explain your interpretation or what it means to you, something.
Sure, that's a great question. In 2005, NGOs, politicians, leaders, professionals, grassroots movements came together and put together a call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Now, these boycott, divestment, and sanctions measures. Now, there's been a lot of B and D. We still have not achieved the S part of BDS yet, but eventually, that's what caused the crumbling of the South African apartheid regime. And this will also cause the crumbling of the Israeli apartheid regime once we get to that S part of BDS. The demands of BDS, and this is critical to understand and present to your elected officials, and I have presented this to our elected officials. The demands of BDS are minimalist in nature. Zionist demands are maximalist in nature. But the reverse is portrayed in our media. BDS is maximalist. Zionist demands are minimalist. And let me explain to you why. The BDS movement does not call for a Nakba against the Jewish people. It's not calling for, an eye for an eye approach. That's not what it's calling for. Boycott, divestment, sanctions is calling for the basic international norms and basic rights that are guaranteed to the Palestinian people under international law. So it calls for full equality for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. It calls for the end of the occupation of all Arab lands. Notice it uses the term Arab lands. Remember, Israel still occupies the Golan Heights, which belongs to Syria. So the ending the occupation of Arab lands, including, of course, the West Bank and Gaza, full equality for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and the repatriation, the right of return for the Palestinian refugees. These are all enshrined in international law. So the call is for, hey, you meet the basic minimalist demands under international law, We'll stop boycotting. We'll stop divesting. We'll stop sanctioning. That's all we're calling for. These basic minimalist demands. What you want, Zionist movement, you want maximalist demands. You want the denial of Palestinian rights. You want to entrench your military occupation, which is against international law. You want to blockade Gaza, which is against international law. You want to afford national rights for your Jewish citizens, but not for your Palestinian Arab citizens. That's against international law. You want to maintain an apartheid regime within all of historic Palestine. That's a war crime. You have to end these basic demands. What Israel wants is we have to normalize these basic demands. Palestinians must renounce and relinquish their rights guaranteed under international law, and then we can negotiate some kind of demarcation where you can have a state of your own. So that's maximalist in nature. BDS is minimalist in nature. And when you present that to your elected officials and have them sit back and analyze it in that way, say, well, wait a minute, that's international law. This is against international law. So are you for international law or are you against international law? That's really the question. And the answer obviously is they will either answer it honestly or they'll go back to that reframing. And what you have to do is make sure you bring it back and present it the way that I just did. And better.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a really good way to frame it. So I'm asking one last question and then we will turn it over to our president for closing. Thank you, Tarek, so much. This was super informational and you were able to frame it in ways that are really accessible to everyone on the spectrum of understanding the situation, or the conflict itself, or I guess not conflict, the assault.
If I can just briefly respond to that, I have this debate with a lot of my friends all the time about the term conflict. You know, based on its dictionary definition, there's various levels to it. So it's not wrong to explain it that way. Just make sure you emphasize the asymmetrical nature of it. That's all.
Yep, there you go. So my last question is about if you do ever reference Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, if you do, what would be publications or different resources from their site that you would say that we should read if you do?
From which website?
Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, based in Bethlehem area.
Oh my God! I most of the information that I get on refugees and the demographic, the demography that exists with the refugee community within the various Arab states that surround Palestine and from within, they're a phenomenal resource. But in terms of what subpart, I'm not sure I would know what. I mean, I just go straight to the source and I just navigate. Not sure how to answer that question, to be honest with you. Besides that.
Thank you. That is super helpful, and I'll post their site below. Thank you.
And the presentation given by who was that from Badil on here, Middle East Peace Now. It's an excellent.
Shumali.
Yeah, that's an excellent presentation, and you know she fleshes out some of the basic misconceptions about Palestinian refugees.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We'll have the president speak now.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Janet, are you there?
There. I thought I had unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And there I am. Thank you, Tarek. I echo Ruben's comment that this was, quote, a fabulous forum. I continue to learn. We all continue to learn, even though we have been involved and passionate about this mess for many, many years. So again, we thank you. And thank you to Maya and Maddie for doing all of the technical issues and conducting the Q&A. It's very much appreciated for your contributions today. Thank you everyone for attending. This is a reminder to complete the very short evaluation whose link may be found in the sidebar. We really want to hear your comments. We are continually striving to improve our forums. And speaking of our forums, as long as COVID is rearing its ugly head, we will continue to present our forums via Zoom rather than in person. We are all awaiting the month and the day when that can happen. Also, please check the chat for information on a human rights rally at General Mills headquarters this coming Tuesday at 5:30. WAM is a sponsor of that event, as well as the Northfielders for Justice in Palestine and Israel, as well as Middle East Peace Now. So that's an important event that we can all participate in. Again, if you have not yet voted for our candidates for board members, please do so. Election results will be posted in a follow-up email, along with today's forum recording and a link to register for next month's forum, which will feature Abdallah Salah, who was born and raised in Gaza and is currently a student at Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. For now, as long as, let's see, I think I already read that. I think that does it. Finally, if you're new to Middle East Peace Now forums and like what you see and hear, please, please, please consider being a member by submitting yearly, very reasonable dues. They help sustain the high quality of our speakers. I think you will agree that we do get high quality speakers. We've posted a link in the chat to our donation page, either on givemin.org or on mepn.org. And finally, we will be participating in GiveMin's Giving Tuesday, which will take place in November. Please consider making an additional donation in addition to your dues so that we can continue to host these quality forums. Thank you for your support and goodbye. Have a great day.